and I welcome its introduction this evening.
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, it's with some regret that I rise to oppose this bill, not because I don't believe that we should have victim-centred legislation. I believe that we should, but I believe that this legislation is a thoroughly inadequate way of ensuring that offenders genuinely address the wrongs that they've done to their victims. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, from the perspective of the Minister of Justice who put in place the original piece of legislation, the Prisoner and Victims Claims Act of 2005. And I did that at a time when we were dealing with the residue of a Department of Corrections that had gone beyond the law and had breached the responsibilities that it had for the proper care of prisoners. Prisoners are there, they're locked up because they've committed terrible crimes, they are there because they deserve to be there. But in our society we do operate a system whereby the agencies of state are not exempt from the law, they have to operate under it. And when they breach the law they should be called to heel on that. But I was faced with a situation arising out of what the Corrections Department put in place called the Behaviour Modification Regime. And that regime was found, started under National, was continued under Labor, was found to be in breach of international requirements on us. But the fear that I had was that there were some lawyers that were keen on gold mining this case to make a lot of money for themselves and to give a bit of it to the inmates. And it is outrageous. Mr. Chevelle, I'm sure you recognise that most lawyers wouldn't sink to such depths, but unfortunately it happens. But what worried me, when I looked at the individual cases of the inmates that were covered by the Tonoa case, and they had done horrendous things to their victims, and not one of them, Mr. Speaker, had paid a penny in reparation or restitution to the victims. And the reason for that was pretty straightforward. They came from dysfunctional backgrounds, they had no savings, they had no income because they're going to be locked up for a long time, and the victims got nothing, and suddenly the offenders, because of the Corrections Department breaching its responsibilities, were going to get a large handout. And I thought that that was fundamentally wrong. I just thought it doesn't make sense. Yes, the state has been wrong in its actions, but why should these guys get the money and their own victims get not a cent in compensation? And it seemed wrong to me, and I brought this legislation in. I've got to say to the members opposite that the National Government opposed it. And the National Government also made, a National Party in opposition I should say, opposed it and made some outrageous statements that we should ignore all United Nations conventions about the treatment of prisoners. They're singing a different song in government, Mr. Speaker, and that's probably a good thing. What I wanted to see was what I have always believed in as a system of restorative justice. Restorative justice is probably the best form of justice because it requires when somebody harms another person, there is a responsibility on the offender to put things to right for the victim to the extent that they're able to. And there are a lot of different ways in which you can put things right. Sometimes it's by showing genuine remorse. And apologising and asking for forgiveness. Now, that can be shallow and it can mean nothing, or it can be genuine. And when it's genuine, it has a real impact on the victim. And in some societies, the Samoan culture, for example, have a practice called a whonga, where the offender has to go and cover himself with a fine mat and sit in front of the victim's house until the victim is prepared to forgive them. And, you know, we might be disparaging about those things, but that produces a real form of natural justice. Now, the other way you can do it is by restitution and reparation. And, you know, money doesn't solve everything, but if a victim is suffering financial consequences from what the offender has done to them, getting restitution actually does make a difference. And it's a concrete form of payment from the offender to the victim. And that should happen. And of course, it doesn't happen for the reasons that I talked about before. Mr. Speaker, I wasn't sure how this new regime was going to work, and I therefore put some sunset clauses into it. I wanted to see how the thing would work, if it was effective, then you might continue it. If it needed improving because it didn't come up to the standards that we wanted, we could make those changes, or we might decide that simply after the Tonoa case, this wasn't a frequent enough event to actually have special legislation to cover. And the idea was that there would be a proper review of the legislation. Well, sadly, Mr Speaker, the National Party after 2008 in government did not do that review. And we were caught in the situation last year where the legislation was going to expire and there was nothing in place that would improve the situation for the victim. So the Labor Party in opposition did the responsible thing and said to the Minister, we will work with you, we will extend this legislation for a year until we do that review, we will work together for the good of the victims in this country, and we'll try and find a better way of doing it. Well, maybe Charles Chauvel and I were naive, but we actually accepted the Minister at a word. I've got to say to this House, Mr Speaker, that the Minister breached her undertaking and her promise. There was no consultation. There was no review that I can actually see, that any meaningful review that even took place. So we wasted the time last year in extending the legislation, still no review, no consultation, no attempt to reach across the House and say let's work together and get something that really does work properly for victims. So, Mr Speaker, I think that is a disgrace, and I think on that basis it's impossible to support this piece of legislation. But I want to still do my best to be constructive for the Minister and to say this is still an opportunity to do the right thing for victims across the board. I'm not interested only in helping that tiny number of victims where they are in a situation where their offender gets a payment from the state because the state has breached its obligations. That covers a tiny number of people. And every day I read about and I talk to people about a situation where the victims are left penniless and the offender does nothing for them. And one of the worst examples of that, Mr Speaker, is in the case of white-collar offenders. White-collar offenders come from the top levels of society often. They are the accountants and the lawyers and the financiers. They live pretty well. But they get greedy and they get reckless, or both, and they rip people off. And I've got people in my electorate that have lost their life savings to white-collar offenders. Now, you know, to do credit to the courts, there's been some reasonably tough sentences that are brought down. But in the end, those offenders will do a couple of years in prison and they'll come out. And we've seen it happen in the past. They'll come out, and because they've got the education and the contacts and the backing, they'll make a lot of money again. Everything will be sweet for them, but my victims are living out the last days of their life with their savings destroyed by these crooks that rip them off. And those crooks go back into society and they never have to pay the money back. And what makes it even worse, Mr Speaker, what makes it even worse is that they're protected by trust laws. They go into prison, they make no payment in reparation or too little payment, but they have their money protected and or hidden in family trusts. So they come out of prison, they've got the money there because it's been protected, they've got the skills and the education and the contacts to make a lot more money, and the victim is locked out on the outside. And I say to this government, that's what they should be looking at. They should be looking at a much wider scheme that ensures that those who have committed offences against society and against their victims are required to set things right for their victims. This bill does nothing of that sort. This bill is a cop-out, it's second-rate, it's a broken promise by the Minister that did not honour her undertaking to consult with the opposition over this. She sat on her hands and done nothing, brought this legislation back into the House that does practically nothing. We hear the fine-sounding speeches from the members of the government talking about victims' rights, but with a piece of legislation that hardly touches on victims' rights and set things right for the victims of our society, when the offenders should be made to do that. And I say to the government, this legislation is not good enough. We're opposing it because it does not do what it should be doing for the victims. And I ask them finally to honour the promise that they made across the House and bring in proper legislation that would do the right thing for victims, Mr Speaker.
David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.